Welcome to the Keeping the Nostalgia Alive show. I am your host, Billy. As you can see with us is legendary racing broadcaster Paul Page, who has a book out called Hello, I'm Paul Page. It's Race Day in Indianapolis. And who hasn't really heard those words? My first 500 listening to on the radio was 1967. My first 500 that I went to, and we sat in the infield because I lived a little while over in Hallville off of 1210 Winfield. We walked to the track, sat in between turns 1 and 2. Danny Sullivan had that spin out, won the Indianapolis 500. You also went to the Indianapolis 500 as a kid so you can get your initial sunburn so you could be tanned for the rest of the summer. What are the odds? The odds are 1 in 365. Both Paul Page and I have the same birthday, November 25th, if I'm not mistaken.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Every once in a while, it falls on Turkey Day, and it's going to fall on Thanksgiving this year, right?
Yeah.
And I also am named after Wild Bill Cummings, who won the 1934 Indianapolis 500.
That's extremely cool.
So there's a little bit of 6 degrees of separation, and there's nothing like chatting with you today. And I want to talk about your book, wherever you can get your book, all kinds of stuff. So welcome to the show, and I thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about growing up. I know you were an Army brat, I guess is that right? What they call it?
And M-brat. I'm an M-brat.
And you started out in Evansville.
Mm-hmm.
And
go ahead. I was born in Evansville, and I think we lived there all of 6 months. And my mom, my real father was a naval aviator, and of course I was born in 45, so right at the end of the war, or just after the end of the war. And so something happened there, and Mom left him, and we ended up in Indianapolis living with my great uncle, Harry Geisel. And my mom apparently had something for uniforms because she married an Army colonel almost immediately, and we were back on the military track. And I've got right over here, I wish I could grab them. They're in a drawer though. My report cards for my first 12 years of school, K through 12, and I've got 12 of them. So we went a lot of places and did a lot of things. And then of course I ended up here in Indianapolis because I wanted to, after a wonderful 1 year in college where I partied my way through and then got asked not to come back, and then the Army, and then I came right back here to Indianapolis just because I wanted to be close to the race, and it worked out.
Before we get any deeper, can you tell me a little bit? And did you get any stories? Were you inquisitive with your? I think it's your great uncle, and he was
my great uncle. Yes,
great uncle,
mm-hmm.
And he, umpired games with Lou Gehrig.
Right.
Did All-Star Games, World Series. Were you inquisitive as a youngster to find out information from him, and what was it like to chat and talk with him and have?
That's actually, it's a great observation on your part, because it did happen, and I absolutely haven't discussed it that much with a lot of people. But he was an American League umpire, was a senior guy, umpired 3 World Series and a couple of All-Star games. But he was there up until 46 as an active umpire. So he umpired the greats, the Gehrigs, the Babe Ruths. And those players in those days had class. Not that they don't today, but I mean, they took their role of being heroes to young men very seriously. And he himself, if you would look his name up in Wikipedia, Harry Geisel, Geisel, there's a picture of him in his umpire's outfit. And I mean, he's dressed to the nines. I mean, he could be going to a formal ball in that outfit. And so that's the style that he had. And he started giving speeches. He actually had to retire from baseball early because he was run over by a base runner and suffered a concussion and couldn't umpire anymore. But the American League, of course, kept paying him, but he became a public speaker telling stories about baseball. And so I think that influenced me more as a performer than the journalistic side of it was. And he would take me down to, there was a stage downtown at Murat Theater, and he put me up in the middle of the stage and sit in the front row. And I'm like 9 years old, and he's teaching me to be a public speaker. So he had a tremendous influence. The journalistic side, I think, came more when I actually started doing real journalism, a little bit in high school, and then thereafter when I actually did it professionally.
What sports were you interested as a youngster? I know your first Indianapolis 500 was 1960, but what broadcasters, when you would listen to a baseball game or even news reports on the radio, and I'm not saying I love old time radio, and I used to get those old cassettes from Marsh when they would have them once a week at Marsh grocery store. But what were some, you'd hear the greatest sports moments, and you'd hear Mel Allen, and you'd hear.
This too is a pretty good question, because I really didn't. I was not a big sports fan. I wanted to play football in high school. My parents wouldn't let me because it was dangerous. So I was doing all the intramural sports, but I wasn't really involved in anything. I really would have liked to play football, but so as a result, I like motorsports, and that's really pretty much all I liked. So to pull out anybody in particular, I would have to pull out the guy's name was Jim McIntyre, and he was the voice of the Indianapolis Indians here in Indianapolis. And my uncle took me to the ball games, and he'd take me up to the press booth, and I got to go over to the radio booth and watch Jim work. And I think that's certainly my first real contact with broadcasting. But I was interested in him more as a broadcaster than I was interested in the game. I think probably my uncle oversaturated me with baseball, and I knew too much about it at one point.
Speaking of that beautiful Busch Stadium on 16th Street, what a fantastic place to watch a baseball game.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was that, it was like the Cubs Stadium. It was really pretty. Now it's condominiums.
My wife asked
me. But you know that. Did you go down there at all?
Yes, I went back this last summer, and it's kind of sad.
Yeah, it is. It is. But the new ballpark they have is really pretty too. So.
Yes, it is. So how did you become a Golden Hurricane?
University of Tulsa, or TU. I wanted in high school, you're going through those senior college visitation days, and the University of Tulsa had a couple of things going for it. One, it had an excellent school of broadcasting. John DeRemus was a disc jockey. Well, he was more classy than just a disc jockey at WMAQ in Chicago. And when I was in high school, I went down and visited him at WMAQ in the Merchandise Mart, and he was kind enough to let me sit in and watch, because I was nuts about broadcasting. And I was doing this high school show that we did every Saturday in Waukegan at WKRS radio. So I was a huge fan of his, and he played really sedate evening music, and it was a very class show. And he had this enormous voice, but he used it so gently. And good evening, welcome, beautiful music here for you today. And it was also a time when the musicians union, they had to play all the records. The disc jockey sat at a little corner, and then there was a staff announcer in another corner. So it was a cool place to be. Well, John DeRemus went to Tulsa, so I thought that was cool. And there were a couple of other pretty big names in the industry who had gone to Tulsa and done very well. So I decided that's where I wanted to go. And it was, the problem is I only liked the courses that had to do with speech and broadcasting. And there were these other niddly little things like, humanities that they really wanted me to know about, and I didn't. So I was gone.
You know, it's interesting when I do some research for these shows. I thought the University of Tulsa was a lot bigger than,
Mm,
when you think of Tulsa, you think of Oklahoma and you think of the Sooners.
right. No, it's
So
pretty small.
yeah, yeah, I put Tulsa in that same category, and there's what you perceive, and then what there's reality.
Well, and when I was there, which was 63, 64, it was the number one passing team in football in the country. We had an all-star, John Simmons, who went to play Canadian football. But I was kind of proud of that, and I would go up to the broadcast booth that they had there for the local college station. I wasn't part of it because I was only a freshman, but now you don't even know Tulsa as a football power at all. They're a big basketball power, but then we were number one passing team in the country.
And what's interesting too, it's like one of seven, I think, names of schools that don't end in S. The Golden Hurricane.
Wow.
It's like in baseball. There's the Red Sox and the White Sox, and
right.
people are like, oh, those end in S. No, they don't. So it's very hard to find college teams that their mascots or the name of don't end in S.
Yeah. And any city that has a giant statue of the Golden Driller is kind of significant too.
So at a young age, or at what point did you keep a journal? Did you keep a diary? Or how some people just have that great mind where they catalog everything in their mind. At what point in time, because we're going to get into the book a little bit, do you jot these memories down? I mean,
unfortunately, no. And it was probably the greatest single mistake of my life, because in retrospect, I was present for so many incredible things. And when we're starting to write the book, it's like, well, I remember that, but did that happen in this year or that year? And it just, I didn't have at first the detail that I really wanted. It's because I hadn't written stuff down, and it'd be interesting because you'd go along and you're writing this section and you remember two or three things all of a sudden that related to that. So then I'd write those down as separate notes, and then I'd go back and research them. Interestingly enough, of all the research I did, which was massive, I mean, this is 5 years in the writing, the best source for me, other than what I knew for myself, and by the way, as far as I don't think the public's going to believe in it, but there's a whole second book there of nothing but anecdotes that there wasn't room. I mean, the book itself is actually too large. We went over the limit from the publisher's point of view. So, but there's another whole book there. Anyhow, the way I researched things that was most efficient was I went back and looked at every piece of film or video and most of the photographs throughout my time at the Speedway, meaning from 1960 onward. And when I would watch some of those or look at those, I wasn't looking really for the primary object, but who's in the background, what's in the background. And that would stimulate all kinds of different memories that were, they were pleasant. Suddenly I'm reliving all these wonderful moments that were wonderful, not just to me because I was there, but because they now, in retrospect, they're really significant moments in the Indy 500's history and in the broadcasting of the Indy 500. So going back and looking those help. But if you haven't done it, start your journal right now, because there's going to be some point you're going to want to read it.
Now, I know we can find the book on Amazon.com, but do you have a Facebook page? Do you have a website where they could also get the book?
No, no, I don't. I have a Facebook page and an Instagram page, and there is a lot of information about the book in there. But Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, local bookstores all have them. So there's a bunch of different places that you can get them. I think your best deal right now is at Amazon. So, and I'm going out during the Long Beach race this year. There is a very famous bookstore in Los Angeles called Autosport Aerosport, and given their name, they deal primarily in motorsports books and aircraft books. And I'm going to go out there and spend a day signing books and everything. I just want to see the place because I hear great things about it.
Who do you feel opened the door for you?
Uncle Harry. um, Uncle Harry by inspiring me. The constant moving in the military and everything, and my stepfather being an officer who was not there. I mean, he served in Korea and was gone quite a bit of the time. But my family did make a deal with Uncle Harry that because I kind of bonded to him in that period of time between my mom leaving my dad and then marrying my stepdad, I lived with him and we bonded. And so he became the prime mover in terms of how I followed my life and what I wanted to be. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. And thank you for your service, by the way. Can you tell us a little bit about your military career?
No, it's not very interesting. We touch on it in the book. The publisher actually didn't want to do much with it at all. But I felt it was important to at least say I was there, you know, that I served. And I really enjoyed, in retrospect, I really enjoyed the service. In fact, there was a point at which I was seriously thinking that might be something for me because I was so ingrained in the service. And I enjoyed the discipline, and you got to do a lot of really cool things. So, but we decided instead to merely touch on it and how it affected things one way or another later. For example, there's a whole part in the book about how I did a lot of work with SWAT teams, with the FBI SWAT team and Indiana State Police SWAT team. So you kind of had to have the military to qualify me to be doing what I was doing, helping train SWAT teams. So,
at what point in time does it click and you're like, you know what? Let's do this book?
It wasn't so much a click as it just kind of oozed on me. I started writing it for my family. I wanted my kids to know what I'd done. And the original book, of course, then has a lot of family things. And that book kind of still exists and it'll be finished up eventually for the family. But then I thought, maybe somebody would actually be interested in some of this, because I was there for a lot of significant events in the 500 history. I was present. I could tell them from a different point of view. Plus, I could tell a lot of anecdotes, pleasant things. I didn't want to show and tell. I wanted something that would show you how truly remarkable all these people really are. And so a guy came to me, J.R. Elrod, who is a co-author on the book, and he said, "Why don't we write a book?" And okay, I still wasn't particularly sold on it because I really didn't. I was afraid it was going to be too niche. We'd sell 20 of them, but he did something for me in my writing. I'm a journalist, basically, so I write as a journalist primarily. I can do dramatic writing, hence the Delta Force openings for the Indy 500 and that. But when I was writing for myself, I'm writing like a journalist, August 25th, 10 a.m., this happened kind of thing. And he took it and added life to it that I wasn't able to bring to it. And then once I felt him doing that, I thought, maybe we have a shot here at actually doing something. So he and I collaborated for 2 years, and then we finally put the book together and really turned it over just in January of this year, when we finally were ready to do something with it.
So we're talking to the legendary racing broadcaster, Paul Page, who has a book out called "Hello, I'm Paul Page. It's race day in Indianapolis." I can just hear it on the AM radio. And for those youngsters out there, that's there's a radio and there's a dial and there's an FM and there's an AM. And I had this small transistor radio that had a little speaker, and I turned it on. I put it underneath my pillow because we didn't have headphones or those little white phones yet. But you can get his book at Amazon.com. What, besides legendary race car drivers, who are some of the people that you've met along your career, like you've shaken their hand or you've met them and you're like, I wouldn't have met this person if it wasn't for the path and journalism and broadcasting road that I went down?
Actually, one of them happened recently. 2 years ago, the last time we had a full Indy 500, I'm out walking out in the starting grid, and they're clearing the starting grid and getting ready for the race. And a guy that I know through my kind of law enforcement connections, is the Secret Service guy here. He said, "Hey, do you want to meet Clint Hill?" And you may not know who he was. He was the guy that jumped on the back of the Kennedy limousine during the assassination and pushed Jackie down. And I'm like, oh my goodness, yes. And we stood there, Clint Hill and I stood there and talked a little bit about that, but talked even more about the fact that he's an absolute connoisseur in the making of martinis. But here's a historic figure. I mean, I'm in college when that happened. And I remember all the shots of him jumping on the back of the limousine, taking a couple of steps, flying steps to get there. And I'm talking to him because of my connection with the 500, and he's there loving the 500. There are a number of those that happened to me, tangentially, that really, in a lot of ways, didn't have anything to do with racing. I mean, I just put a picture up on Facebook of a guy that I met, really great guy. His name is Ed Liu. He's an astronaut. And he, at the time, and I think it's still true, is the only astronaut to go to the International Space Station on the shuttle and the Soyuz. And he had a lot of extra vehicular time. But he and I became really close buddies. And that was part of the guy who was running, was the flight director for NASA at the Johnson Space Center. It was a huge race fan. And I met him one time. He came up to the race at Texas. In fact, the race that didn't happen in Texas. And we became close because I was a space nut. And so now I have all these connections with the Johnson Space Center. I got to fly their full motion shuttle twice, deorbit to landing. So I meet Ed, and Ed's on the space station. And one day I'm at Texas Speedway, and I'm walking through the parking lot, and the phone rings, my cell phone rings. And I answer it, and he says, "Hey, how you doing?" And I said, "Who is this?" He says, "It's Ed." I said, "It can't be Ed. Ed's on the space station." "No, I'm calling you from the space station." Well, they have Wi-Fi on space stations, so they could do that. And it's like, I didn't know you could do that. I'm standing in the middle of the parking lot, and I'm talking to the space station. And he, from the space station, the thing that I just posted on Facebook, he took a picture from the space station of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and of the Texas Speedway, and he sent them to me and autographed them. I've got one of them. Here. You think you have nostalgia stuff in the background? This is there's a picture from space of the space station.
That is awesome.
I also started doing, when I started with NBC, a full time for a network is usually like 26 events a year. And when I was with NBC, we were pushing auto racing. The guy who was running NBC at the time, Don Olmeyer, was 100% auto racing guy. And he was the guy that created the first television contract for CART. But throughout that time, because I didn't have enough races, like 13 a year, I had to cover a bunch of other events. And so I've covered the Rubik's Cube World Championship from the Opera House in Budapest. And as a result of some of those events, the more legitimate ones, I've met a lot of significant people. I've done an Olympics. I also got to not do an Olympics because I was supposed to do the 80 games in Moscow, and Jimmy Carter stopped those. So my Olympics really, Calgary is the primary one. But in that, meeting all of those incredible people and from different disciplines of sport. So it's I never would have guessed it ever would have happened to any of it. And it's so neat to look back on it now and know that you were there. It was cool. You were standing there when that happened.
So It's not easy to write a book. Was you said about 5 years, and then you have to be like a musician. You have to go on tour and you
Yeah.
promote your book. What have you done to promote your book? What is your upcoming schedule for
Well,
promoting your book
mostly
signings?
stuff like what we're doing right now, which I enjoy thoroughly. Yeah, a lot of people think that it's work doing the different appearances for that, but it's not. The people who come are they're interested in those things that I'm interested in, and like you and I, we can sit there and talk, and we go off on this angle or that angle, and it's thoroughly enjoyable. The Indy's got a race coming up a week from this weekend, a Grand Prix, and I'm going to be at the Speedway Museum on Friday the 13th, which is the qualifying day for the race. And I'm going to give a reading in the museum and just be there for the day, probably do a couple readings. And then on race day, the 14th, Saturday, I'll be in the plaza behind the pagoda at one of the chalets, again, signing books, talking with people. And I love every minute of that. That's, you both get going. Hey, I was 1963. I was here. Oh, I was a grandstand down from you, kind of thing. So you share memories, you share good times, and I really like it. It's probably tedious to some, but not to me.
I saw a great quote the other day, and it took me a little while to grasp it. And it said, and it's from Al Unser Sr. It said, "You haven't won the Indianapolis 500 until Paul Page says you
Oh,
won
it's
the
Junior.
Indianapolis
Yeah,
500."
yeah.
Oh, Junior. Okay.
Yeah, he reminded me of that. Actually, he and I we were doing a speech together locally, and he and I'd always been really good friends. And we'd go up, for example, every winter, we'd go snowmobiling at Eagle River, Wisconsin. And that turned into a major event every winter in January because his dad would go, Bobby would go, Rick Mears would come along, and we'd spend 3 days just riding motorcycle or riding snowmobile trails up there. So we became, result of that and other things, pretty close. And one day I was telling him I'm writing a book, and he says, "Well, don't you remember what I said about, if you're looking for quotes and things?" I said, "No, I really don't." And he pointed out, I think it was in USA Today, that he was quoted as saying, "You haven't won the Indy 500 until Paul Page says you have." Well, that's a bit of a reach, but okay, I'll accept that. So I stuck that in the book too. And there's some really nice testimonials in the front of the book that a number of them were just offered. Hey, if you're going to do the book, why don't I write something? I mean, to have Nigel Mansell, who's kind of outside of that world, but still in, I want to write something about you. So there are a lot of nice testimonials, probably too many. I probably overdid it, got too braggartly. It's at this stage to know that people actually thought those things. That's a very good feeling.
When you're, doing broadcasting or on camera, what are those times, or what's some of the things that you've thought of and you have to take your mind back to what your great uncle told you when he put you on that center stage? Did your mind ever wonder, and how do you bring it back to what you need to focus on?
I don't entirely understand what you're asking.
So I could be asking you a question, and all of a sudden through my head is like, I have to get hamburger meat out of the freezer so it can thaw. When those odd thoughts, did you ever get those odd thoughts, or how did you focus? How a basketball player stretches and does warm-ups before a game? How would you free your mind, or get ready for a broadcast in your career?
Well, you start with, you remember it's a global audience and there are millions of people out there. And that gets your attention. Interestingly enough, I never had stage fright. I have terrible stage fright if I'm giving a speech to 100 people, but I can go on camera and talk to the globe, no problem. I've had moments, where for a brief moment while Bobby or Sam or somebody is answering me, Scott Goodyear, where I'm looking at him and he's answering a question and I'm drifting. I'm like, oh, I should really be listening to this answer. So that's happened a couple times. More often than that, it's getting distracted by something off camera. Um, at Walt Disney Speedway one year, we were bringing Danny Sullivan on as a new member of the crew, and it was his first on-camera appearance. And it was really a tiny area that we had to work from for the on-camera. And so Bobby came on first, sat next to me, and I interviewed Bobby, and then I led to some piece of video. And while I'm talking about that, they switched out and put Danny alongside me. Well, when I come back on camera, I turn and here's Danny, and he starts to talk, and he's got a frog in his throat, and he's choking. And I'm looking past him because I'm looking this way at him, and Bobby is standing just off frame and laughing his butt off. Whoa, it's not that easy, is it, Danny? Kind of thing. And they were yelling at me in my ear, the little IFB that we get all the directions from. Save him, get him out of that. Other than just start talking again, I wasn't sure how I could save him. You get a lot of those. And then, of course, in that little thing in your ear, not just in on cameras, but during the entire show, you're hearing from the producer or the director in the truck. And most of the people I worked with found out that I was pretty good at listening to directions while I was talking. And so they talk more. And sometimes it would even get conversational. Bob Goodrich, who was my producer for a long time, I'd be going along telling a story, and he suddenly in my ear, I'd hear, "That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard." And Jack Arute used to just laugh, because generally the producer, when he talked to me, he could talk to me privately and direct, but he also had an all call that all the other announcers would hear. And generally they used the all call. And, Jack he'd start howling. You get to a break, and he said, "I can't believe they did that to you." But it was fun. It was a game that we played. But there are times when it could be distracting, and there was more than one occasion that I pushed our little talkback button. I said, "Shut the hell up. I'm trying to work here."
Sitting at home, listen to it on the radio, watching it on TV, it looks, specifically the Indianapolis 500, and you guys pulled it off every year. What goes into getting, and what size group are we talking about that gets that whole thing together and going for a broadcast, be it over the radio or on TV? We're at home going, oh, there's Bob Lamey coming to us. There's Paul Page, but what kind of a production, what kind of scale is that like, or how many hours go into preparing for that?
Let's talk about radio first. In radio, it's a small group. It's the announcers that are there, depending on the year, the 7 to 8 guys who did the Indy 500 each year on the radio network. And in that case, a director who was more a manager. He wasn't active in the telecast or the broadcast, and 2 engineers. It's a small group, and it's a redundant group. It's same guys every year. And, somebody finally would quit and go somewhere else, then it's another guy. And pretty much, if in my era, if you were there and you did good, and nobody ever did bad, then you were going to be there as long as you wanted to be. And it was so nice to have the tradition of that. Every year began with a breakfast, then at the old Speedway Motel when it existed, and we'd talk about the race. But as soon as the race was over, all of us would get together individually or in small groups and start talking about how we can make it different. May listen to a little piece of tape or something. But that being a once a year broadcast, that's how that worked. Now, a couple of years ago, I went back and did the radio network again, and we did the entire season. And again, it's a very, very compact little group, and you get just so accustomed to one another that you're finishing sentences for other people, which makes it a great broadcast. You're not saying, "Well, what did you think, Frank?" You're just making a statement, and Frank picks it right up. Television is entirely different. In many ways, I like radio a lot more. Television, takes a lot of the control away from the announcer and puts it on somebody sitting in a semi truck in the middle of the infield, who in a number of cases is from New York and only knows about taxi cabs, which made it kind of difficult to convince people from time to time. And I remember Robin Miller, who great writer. Love things that Robin did. Except when I got to ABC, and I'd known Robin since we raced together. And I had a Formula Ford. He was in Formula Fords, and he went to midgets and quarter midgets, and I stayed in the road racing. But we go back to like 70. And when I got to ABC, Robin would just cream me every time I turned around. Robin was writing something critical. And a lot of it was directed at me. And then he went to work for NBC a couple of years ago. And it wasn't 2 months that he'd been on the job. And he pulls me aside and he says, "Everything I ever said about you, I apologize for. I had no idea how stupid some people can be with racing." So, but the television is, it's a much larger group. For Indy, the total staff was just short of 100, between 75 and 100 each year. The production staff is a producer and a director and a assistant director, and maybe a couple of associate producers. An associate producer would be the one who would go out and you do a feature together. But when you got on the air, the actual group that's doing it is really that producer and that director and the announcers. So it being an ongoing thing, you were constantly talking about it. As soon as an event was over, you go look at the tape and you'd say, well, we could have done this better, or this was really stupid. And so that was a living thing through the season, not just the Indy 500. But the thing about television broadcasts is part of what you're doing almost all of the time is covering for something that isn't working. That is to say, you lose feeds from two key cameras on the circuit. And it takes 20 minutes or whatever to get them back up. Something's happened. The cable's been driven across. Well, you don't want to let the audience know that that's going on. So a lot of your job is just to kind of cover things like that. The first Brickyard 400, I was the host, and then joined Bob Jenkins and Benny Parsons in the booth for play-by-play. But I had to open the show and get it going. And just before we were going on the air, there was a power failure at the speedway, and it took our trucks down. Now, we had a small generator, so one of the cameras, the one I had, could be isolated, and that's what's on the air. But we didn't have anything else. We didn't have graphics. We didn't have another camera. It was just that one camera. And I could see from where I was standing on top of the paddock penthouse, I could see down into the compound, and there are people running everywhere. And we had some giant generators there, but they hadn't started them up for some reason. So they're trying to get this going and everything. And I'm standing there with nothing else but ad lib. I can't go, we can't do the planned format. We can't go to Jack. We can't do this or that. And so I'm standing there for like 5-6 minutes before we started to get other equipment back up online. And there's a lot of that in those big productions. We've had ones where the feed satellite is gone, and all we have is an audio connection to the network. So now we're back to doing radio with something on the screen that says video will resume shortly. So that's a challenge, and that's what makes, for me, TV a lot, is more having the wherewithal to be able to do some of those things. I don't have those skills anymore, but it was fun when you know that, hey, I just saved this thing, and we had a number of those, and you get it over, you say, how do we get through that? And the audience never knows it. 2 children? I'm sorry?
2 children? Do you have 2 children?
Yes, I'm sorry. Boy, you switched quick on me. Yes, I have 2 children. I have a daughter Marlowe, who lives in Brooklyn and is the global e-market director for West Elm, the corporation. And then my son is an aerospace engineer, Brian. He's an aerospace engineer by training, but he has worked in IndyCar his entire life. When he was in high school, he worked for Derek Walker, and that was when Robbie Gordon was driving for Derek Walker. And Brian's job was to take apart wrecked race cars. So he had a guaranteed job as long as Robbie Gordon was driving for him. There were a lot of wrecked race cars. And then he went off to Embry-Riddle University and got his aerospace engineering degree. But the whole time he was working for, at first, Team Cool Green, and then that eventually became, as it is today, Andretti Autosports. So he's 45 now, and he's been in racing all his life. He was the guy who, excuse me, who calculated the fuel for Alexander Rossi and his win at the 500. And all I can think of, I knew what they were doing, and I knew they were gonna try to finish that race without that final stop and everything. And all I can think of is Brian when he was like in fourth grade with the big pencil going, 2 + 2 is, if he came up with 5, that car wasn't going to finish. So watching him develop has been a lot of fun too. And of course, I get to see him at the events as well. Though generally he's, I'm too busy, and he is. They're amazingly busy on the race weekend.
I had legendary baseball great Tommy John on, and and someone asked me the other day. They said, "How do you pick your guests for your shows?" And without even thinking, I said, I ask people who I have memories of, so I can ask them questions about those memories. And, just like, the time I spent on listening to the radio, watching on TV, now you have your book out. So, I asked Tommy John, why is your hat always crooked? Do you have a funny sized head? And he got a kick out of that. So my question to you is not as personal as what's wrong with the size of your head, but it is, did you ever have any interaction with Jim Gardner from the Rockford Files?
Oh, absolutely. He and Chuck Yeager, broke the sound barrier, both would hang out in the old timers room at the Speedway. And of course, both of them would come there for the entire time, 3 weeks or 4 weeks, whichever it was. And Jim was, first of all, he was just another guy. He liked to 10 bar in the old timers room, and he'd tell stories and he'd listen to stories, but he was so completely down to earth. We'd get a kick out of him. He stayed at the Speedway Motel, which, it was nice, but it was a one room Holiday Inn kind of motel. He stayed there for the entire time he was there. He could have stayed in a 5-star, but he wanted to be out at the track. And I remember one night we were sitting around the pool at the motel, and here comes Jim, and he's walked down to the McDonald's and got himself his dinner, which apparently he did all the time. He just go get some McDonald's, come back to the room. So he was really straight. He was really fun. And then, there was Paul Newman, and we do a lot with him. At first, he was very standoffish because he had been so put upon by media and fans alike. When he was running SCCA, he actually had a handset telephone that he had turned into something that he put on his belt. Now, it was just the handset of a regular old telephone from home, but somebody be bugging him, he'd pick it up and say hello. Yeah, it went nowhere. And so he finally got to be fun once he realized, we weren't particularly in awe. He was another guy. And like Gary Gerald, at the start of every race, Gary was always out on the starting field, and Newman was out there with their car, with Carl Haas. But Newman would always walk over to Gary just before the start, and he'd take a bet with Gary on who was going to win, the $1 bet. So there was, he did something, and this is in the book, but both of my kids, we took a summer in high school and took one of them on the entire circuit. so they could see what the racing was all about. And the year that I took my daughter, she was like 15, and we were at Laguna Seca, and we're walking through the motor coach area, and there's Paul, and he says hello, and I introduce as my daughter, and he turns into superstar. He all but kneels down and kisses her hand, and please come up into my coach. He entertains her for about a half an hour. He gets the Coca-Cola that she'd like. I mean, he was as gracious as a human being can be. And it was wonderful, except we get out of the trailer and we're walking along, and Marla looks at me and says, "Who was he?" She was too young to know. It just, those people, when they get into racing, are almost to a one really enjoyable to be around, because they're loving the same thing we're loving.
Now, a totally different person, David Letterman.
Oh, Dave. Well, Dave, I know personally from before. I mean, he and I are both massive fans of Wayne Cochran and the CC Riders. And when he was at Ball State, I was working at WIBC in Indianapolis. And if Wayne Cochran would come and play a place called the Holyoke Nightclub, which was a joint on East Washington Street in Indianapolis, but he'd also play, we'd do this Indiana thing where the next show he'd do would be Club 67 up by Ball State. And Dave and I, if Cochran was playing with like in a 70-mile radius, we'd be there. And he was just inherently funny from the start. Even before you saw him as a comedian, you're just talking to him. He's throwing out all these crazy things, and he keeps you laughing. And I don't even think a lot of the time he realized what he was doing. And then he got a job in Indy on one of the local TV stations as a weatherman, and that's the funniest weather forecast you'd ever hear. I mean, he turned around to that satellite map, and the boundaries of the states, one of them was missing. And he'd say, he turned around and says, "Now here's the United States, and I'm against this. I do not think that we should be able to just erase a border between two states." It was a mistake, but he played it. He would congratulate tropical storms on being promoted to a hurricane, stuff like that. He just was so funny. And of course, he worked on one race once, and but he is so low key. If you see a guy with a big beard, you might recognize that it's him. But he hangs around with his team, with Ray Hall and the gang, and he loves racing. They're almost all of them are that way, that they really enjoy the sport so much. You don't really know they're there, and you don't see him as a celebrity.
I know we've gone a little bit long, and we appreciate your time. And you guys can go to Amazon.com and get Hello, I'm Paul Page.
Wait a minute.
It's Race Day in Indianapolis, as here comes the book cover.
It looks like this.
So talk about the forward a little bit, and
which, I'm sorry?
Talk about the forward a little bit, and Mario writing it for you.
The forward, written by Mario, begins with the words, "Paul Page is not a rat." The publisher saw that and went crazy, said, "We got to take that line out of there." And I said, "No, that's the best lines ever been written about me." Mario was saying, and goes on to say, that in my job as a journalist, that I could be trusted. They'd come and they'd tell me things. We're trying this in this race. If it works, you can talk about it. Otherwise, it never happened. And that, immensely helpful to the job that I'm doing. But so that's what he was writing about at first. And then he was making fun of me on one day I was at his place in Nazareth, and he had just gotten a new Ferrari F40, and we went for a ride in that. And then Michael showed up and decided to take out their Lamborghini. And I was excited about riding in that too. But they're talking to me about it, and I call it a count tack. And they both just fall down laughing, because That's not the way you print. What's wrong with you, Paige? You're supposed to know all this stuff. So he gigs me for not knowing how to pronounce Puntash. So, but he writes so personally because we've known each other for so long. I was just looking at a picture a little while ago of him and I as a team in a go-kart race at Nazareth Speedway. And so he writes a little bit from the heart there, and it makes me feel good, and hopefully it attracts you.
Well, last night was funny because I asked my listening device in the house. That's what I call Alexa, my listening device. I asked her about books. I said, tell me about Paul Page. And she went on, Alexa from Amazon, went on to tell us about your book and wanted to know if I wanted to order your book. So please go to Amazon.com, and all you got to do is type in Paul Page and his book will come up. Paul Page, I know we ran a little bit long. I know that.
Well, let's do it again sometime too.
I appreciate your time. Everybody's going to love this. Best of luck with the book, and you answered all of my childish questions. I appreciate it, and thank you so much.
You got it. I really appreciate being part of it. Thank you.